A few people have asked me to make a video about my watercolor technique, so that's what we're going to do today. And this is not a fake smile. Watercolor is it's an intuitive, immediate kind of medium that has a lot in common with the monotype. And watercolor is a challenging medium. It takes some bravery and no hesitation. So without any further hesitation, let's get to it. So I was reminded recently that watercolor is kind of considered a drawing medium as far as painting is concerned, because without good drawing skills and a good design sensibility, it can be a mess, because when you allow the pigment to react and the water to react to the paper, unless you've got some control, it can get kind of crazy. Anyway, so here I've started this basic line drawing, pencil drawing, and this is hot press paper, which is has less tooth. I've been working on hot press lately because I just happen to like the way it responds to the medium, or the medium responds to it. And with watercolor, you have to understand that the white of the paper is the highest highlight. So I work from light to dark. So the lightest, some of the lightest tones, I'll come in and bring in some color like that. This is wet. I could let it dry a little bit, or I could continue wet into wet, come back with maybe some cools. Here. And allowing the white paper to act as your highlight helps create form. Come in here with some dark. This brush is it's a flat watercolor brush, which can create a nice brisk kind of brush stroke. I'm not going to do a lot of talking while I'm painting, because kind of kills my concentration, but we'll see what happens here. As I said earlier, or maybe I didn't say it at all, watercolor requires no hesitation. You can't hesitate. Now, if you come in and it's still wet, and you can come in with a paper towel and blot some up, work back and forth. what's fun is allowing the pigment, the color to bleed when you want it to bleed, and this just requires a lot of practice, and experimentation. A lot like the monotype in that sense. Hard edges against soft edges, of course, help create volume and form. Another thing to think about. And it pays to be bold when you can. Now here I've gone from light to darker back and forth a little bit, just being aware of where my edges are. Try to build from light to dark. And the thing about layers is that as you're making a watercolor, you're going to make adjustments to edges. Like here, I want to soften this up a little bit, so I bring in more water. Bringing in a tighter brush, a smaller brush to make smaller marks. You've noticed that you can come back to wet spots and you want to try something with, for instance here, this edge is a little, I want to make it bleed a little bit. Bring water into wet and let it bleed and see how that works. Okay, we're going to let this sit for a few minutes and dry up a little bit. As far as watercolor brands are concerned, you don't have to, if you're just starting out, of course, you shouldn't have to buy really expensive watercolors. In fact, I find some of the best watercolors are really inexpensive. that's up to you. Prang is actually quite a good, simple, inexpensive watercolor that I think works really well. But be that as it may, coming in with the sharp edge that just brings out the form is important to consider. If you notice how, again, how the pigment responds to wet and dry surfaces. And layers happen as you go light to dark, slightly darker over slightly darker after slightly darker, and it builds up these really interesting forms. Notice how that bleeds like that? And you've got to be able to control all this. And you can't hesitate. And when things happen like this, and I paint it very intuitively, I'm not looking for absolute perfect detail, realism here. This is much more of an expressionist kind of approach. Paper buckles a little bit too. I mean, here I've taped down the paper. Usually I paint when it's attached to a paper block, but I've taped it down. And it can buckle, and you've got to be aware of that and allow for that. And if things start to get out of control, you come back and blot some up. The tip of a paper towel Just the tip of it can blot up some of that water. You can't be afraid. Because fear is your enemy. Pardon that outburst. One way to make a good gray, there are many ways to make grays, but one interesting way is taking a deep alizarin or violet and mixing it with a little green, dark viridian, and it come up with some nice odd grays. Here I'm going to allow this dark to bleed into the slightly lighter value, and then bring this down. Come back and reestablish form here. That dark might be a little dark right there, so plot that. A little bit of red goes a long way. This. You can see when you blot things and the pigment starts to react to the surface and to the paper and to the other pigments, it creates really kind of cool little shapes and textures. Here I kind of like the green that I threw in there and how it reacts to the orange red. But remembering that cools and warms, particularly when you're painting a figure, flesh, the cools and the warms and the different values are important to consider. Now there I threw in too dark, but I'm not sure. That might work. Might work out. Although I think I'm just going to come back and blot this a little bit. And at some point along the way, this is dried so far, these layers. At some point, I start removing the pencil drawing with an eraser. You can use a Staedtler Mars. I like using those, or a kneaded eraser, whatever, to pick out some of the pencil. To reveal more clearly where the color is. What happens sometimes is little mistakes happen, and as I was erasing, there was a little dampness there, and some of the paper came up a little bit. But that can be, when you're painting more or less expressively, you can work around that. But that was a stupid mistake on my part right there. I was kind of rushing it for the sake of the video. At any rate, get rid of some of the pencil, come back, so I can see more clearly what's required. Over here, I'm not really satisfied with what's going on there, so I'm going to come back with a light, warm wash to bring this. See if that works. But again, it's the kind of a medium that requires some bravery and some no hesitation, and things can happen that you don't necessarily intend, and they can work out and maybe they don't work out, but you can always come back in and rework it when it's still wet. And it's a metamorphosis. But when you're approaching painting in this sense, which is kind of very loose, kind of expressive style, you can work out those issues. If you're painting very, very realistically, very tight, very, very detail-oriented and ultra fastidious, then that requires a slightly different approach. Like this, but I want to bring some more cool in the back area of the figure, the shadow area, a cooler blue. Let's see if that works. And bring it right into here too. As far as how much water to pigment you're using, that of course is all, it all depends on practice. And the more water, of course, the lighter the color is going to be. And the heavier amount of pigment, like in here there's a lot of green pigment right there, and it's almost opaque. This is the watercolors I'm using are a vintage vintage watercolor brand. It's not quite gouache. Gouache is kind of an opaque. It's an opaque watercolor. Basically, gouache has the pigments have an opaque quality to them. And one of the greens I used here has a slight gouache quality to it. It pays to be just bold with your strokes. So here, I think this, I'm not really satisfied with this. I think it's just too light here. I want to come back with a dark and punch it up a bit here. Let's just see if it works. And if it doesn't work, well, then it doesn't work. But I think it may require that a little simpler. Kind of a, yeah, I think, let me let that dry, and I think it might be done. So I think this is done for the purposes of this tutorial. It's a challenge to paint live, being videotaped, being recorded for, you know, tutorial purposes. It's but like any watercolor, you never know exactly what you're going to get, and that's the beauty of it. But remember, you have to decide where you'll be putting your brush strokes, and you let it do its thing. It's not a medium to be totally controlled or manipulated, and that, of course, is its beauty. Just remember to be bold when you can, and it just takes a lot of practice and experimentation, and see how the pigment and the water and the brush strokes all work, and what happens and what goes on. This may have gotten a little dark, but I'm okay with it. It's best to keep things light so that the paper comes through and the transparency is there. If it gets a little too opaque, it can be problematic, but I think for the purposes of this, it's working. But it's a lot of fun, and it's a great, simple, inexpensive, direct medium to use, working small. This is a, what, 12 by 9, this image. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you later. Bye-bye.